Moscow, March 1986. Outside the windows, the city looks indestructible. Wide avenues, gray stone, steam rising from vents like breath from a sleeping giant. Inside a government office, paper stacks lean at tired angles, smelling of ink, glue, and old cigarettes. The radiator clanks, then goes quiet. A clerk's fingers hover over a telephone that never stops ringing because every ministry wants the same thing now: hard currency, spare parts, food shipments, relief from shortages they cannot admit to the public. In the Kremlin, Mikhail Gorbachev is trying to make history bend without snapping. He has inherited a system built for certainty, and he is now forced to govern during uncertainty. He is told the same comforting phrase again and again: the Soviet Union is still a superpower. It still has rockets. It still has allies. It still has parity. However, the reality was more fragile. Across the world, the price of oil has fallen hard, and in many retrospective accounts, this drop is framed as a turning point for Soviet hard currency earnings. The Soviet Union is an empire that sells energy to buy time, and time is suddenly more expensive. In the official story, this is still the era of strategic balance. The Soviet flag flies over half of Europe. Its missiles and tanks are counted in the same breath as America's. Its cosmonauts are national saints. For decades, the USSR has proven that it can out-engineer, out-sacrifice, and outlast rivals who claim capitalism is efficient. In school books and parades, the message is simple: history has chosen a winner, and it is marching east to west under red banners. Yet behind that certainty sits a quieter truth. The same state that can loft metal into orbit struggles to move food from farm to city without waste. The same command system that can mobilize a continent cannot reliably produce consumer goods that ordinary families want. And the same leadership that looks confident on television spends nights staring at balance sheets it does not fully trust. Because the space race was never only about rockets, it was about legitimacy, proof that a planned economy could master the future. It was about trade, how many dollars a barrel of oil could buy, how many tons of grain could be shipped, how many spare parts could be imported quietly before the next factory line stops. It was about a competition that looked like science, but functioned like finance. What appeared to be true was that the Soviet Union could still win, still outlast the West with discipline, secrecy, and engineering brilliance. What was actually true was that the USSR was running a hard currency business model disguised as a civilization. And when that business model ran into global market reality, the disguise began to tear. So the question becomes unavoidable. If the Soviet Union could build the symbols of victory, rockets, stations, shuttles, why did it go bankrupt anyway? And why did that bankruptcy arrive right when it still seemed possible to win the race for space? This moment matters because the Soviet collapse was not only a political event, it was a balance sheet event, an empire discovering that prestige projects and security commitments still require payment in the only currency the world accepts. The space race is the perfect lens because it concentrates everything: technology, military anxiety, propaganda, and the brutal arithmetic of scarce resources. The key players sit on multiple chessboards at once. On the Soviet side are leaders shaped by different eras of pressure. Nikita Khrushchev, who tied national pride to spectacular feats. Leonid Brezhnev, who inherited a system that preferred stability over reform. And Mikhail Gorbachev, who later tries to redesign the machine while it is still running. Behind them stands the memory of Sergei Korolev, the chief designer whose early successes made Soviet spaceflight feel like destiny rather than policy. On the other side are American presidents and strategists, Ronald Reagan among them, who interpret Soviet technology through military threat, not scientific wonder. They are not irrational either. From Washington's perspective, a rocket that can deliver a capsule can also deliver a weapon, and a space triumph can also be a security dilemma. What is at stake is not just who plants a flag where. It is whether the Soviet model can keep paying for global influence while its domestic economy produces fewer and fewer goods that the world wants to buy at world prices. It is whether a state that controls its own currency can still be trapped by a currency it cannot print. The earlier arc can be said in 2 sentences. After early space triumphs, the USSR expands commitments from military competition to alliances and client states, while its consumer economy stagnates. When global markets shift, the Soviet system discovers it cannot adapt quickly without breaking its own political rules. To understand how bankruptcy happened, we must examine the economic forces at work and the chain of decisions that turned a superpower's advantage into a trap. It begins with a problem that does not belong in heroic posters: feeding people predictably. Grain harvests swing, logistics fail, and the legitimacy of the system quietly depends on whether bread appears on shelves without chaos. So the Soviet Union does something ideologically awkward. It buys food from its rival. In 1972, the Soviet Union buys about 19 million metric tons of U.S. grain, a purchase large enough to shake global prices and become politically notorious in the United States. That is not a minor trade detail. It is a warning flare. The Soviet industrial state can build miracles in steel, but it must import stability in calories. From the inside, this choice is not stupidity. It is management. If a government believes its legitimacy depends on predictable supply, it will pay almost any price to prevent visible shortage. And in a system where bad news travels slowly upward, leaders often learn the scale of problems late, when the problem is already expensive. The Soviet planners make a rational calculation. If the world will sell grain, then grain can be purchased. If grain can be purchased, then political time can be purchased. And if political time can be purchased, then reform can be postponed until later, when conditions are calmer. Here, the first gamble looks elegant. Export more oil and gas. Earn hard currency. Use that hard currency to buy grain, technology, and anything else the system cannot generate on its own terms. The plan feels almost painless because it does not demand public ideological surrender. It demands only that pipelines run, contracts be signed, and ships arrive quietly in port. At first, it feels like the perfect exchange. The USSR has energy, the world pays in dollars, the state converts dollars into social peace. But there is a problem. But oil exports create a dependency that looks like strength until it doesn't. But hard currency is not just money, it is oxygen in a world market. And the Soviet Union is building an economy that needs oxygen it cannot print. But every successful purchase of foreign grain quietly teaches the system the wrong lesson, that the easiest fix is always external. The trap locks in slowly, like rust. Why restructure agriculture, distribution, and incentives when barrels can pay for imports? Why tolerate political risk at home when international trade can patch the holes? Why admit the system is inefficient when the world keeps accepting Soviet energy? It was not resilience, it was delay. This is also where the space program becomes more than science. Under Khrushchev, spectacular achievements help sell the story of a planned future. The state does not merely promise abundance someday, it seems to prove it with every launch. Under Brezhnev, stability becomes the priority, and stability is expensive. It requires subsidies, guarantees, and the constant reassurance that the great machine still works. Yet even the most brilliant engineering culture cannot fix an economy if the incentives beneath it are misaligned. The USSR can command production targets, but it struggles to command quality, flexibility, and responsiveness, precisely the traits needed to compete in a fast-moving global economy. And the more that global economy becomes interconnected, the more the Soviet model is forced to interact with prices it cannot dictate. The result is a quiet transformation. The Soviet Union begins to treat export earnings not as one tool among many, but as the tool that keeps everything else from being questioned. But the same choice that buys stability also narrows options. Prestige accelerates this narrowing. Space triumphs are not cheap in any system, but in a system that uses space as legitimacy, the political return on investment becomes addictive. A launch does not just put hardware into orbit, it puts confidence into the population, discipline into the bureaucracy, and fear into rivals. It is the kind of spending that feels like it pays for itself because it pays in status. And status, at least in the short term, can substitute for consumer comfort. People tolerate empty shelves more easily when they are told they live in the vanguard of history. This is why the Soviet leadership keeps walking forward. From inside the Kremlin, it still feels like solid ground. Then the world tightens. The Soviet war in Afghanistan begins in late December 1979, and contemporary summaries emphasize that it quickly becomes a major, costly commitment rather than a brief intervention. This is not only a military decision, it is an economic one, because long wars consume fuel, equipment, and political attention that could have been used to modernize at home. But the war also changes the external environment. But the USSR now looks more threatening to the West and more vulnerable to pressure. But the Cold War becomes hotter in the places where budgets bleed quietly. Now Ronald Reagan's administration sits in Washington, D.C. and sees Soviet capability through the lens of worst-case intent. Reagan is not required to be a villain for the logic to turn vicious. If the Soviet Union can match America in space, then perhaps it can match America in missiles, and perhaps it can pressure Europe, and perhaps it can break the Western alliance by intimidation alone. So the West responds with intensified competition, technology, arms, economic leverage, and narrative warfare. This response is not simply emotional. It is a strategy built on the belief that the Soviet economy is brittle, that it cannot indefinitely carry the same burden as a capitalist system with deeper financial markets and more flexible production. In Moscow, the problem is that Soviet leaders cannot afford to assume this is bluff. Deterrence does not reward optimism. It punishes it. So the Soviet leadership tries a second strategy: match the American style of prestige. Instead of narrowing space spending to projects that maximize scientific output per ruble, it tries to mirror a symbol, because symbols shape fear. Instead of X, they tried Y, because they fear that not matching the United States will look like strategic inferiority. This is where the Soviet response to the American space shuttle program becomes a defining escalation. The USSR pours resources into a comparable shuttle system. And retrospective accounts note that the Energia Buran project cost over 16 billion rubles in total. That figure matters not because it can be perfectly translated into today's money, but because it reveals the scale of ambition inside a system already struggling with efficiency. At Baikonur, the steppe wind cuts across concrete and steel, and the launch facilities look like cathedrals of modernity dropped into an ancient landscape. The shuttle, on paper, is a triumph of industrial coordination. It demands precision manufacturing, specialized materials, and supply chains that do not tolerate delay. But there is a hidden cost. But a shuttle is not simply a spacecraft, it is an industrial ecosystem that demands quality control, material science, supply chains, and repeatable manufacturing, areas where the Soviet system is already strained. But when prestige becomes the goal, efficiency becomes secondary, and secondary is where bankruptcy begins. Here, the choice is again rational inside the world that Soviet leaders inhabit. If American officials treat the shuttle as potentially dual use, the USSR cannot ignore it. If propaganda is a battlefield, it cannot surrender the high ground. If prestige translates into deterrence, then prestige must be maintained. So much for neutral ground. Space is never neutral in a Cold War. For a moment, Gorbachev still believes the burden can be eased through diplomacy. He is not wrong to try. Reducing military pressure could free resources, reduce fear, and create political space for reform. On December 8, 1987, the United States and the Soviet Union signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in Washington, D.C., with Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev as signatories. The treaty signals that competition might be made cheaper, that verification might replace some spending, and that the future might allow reallocation of resources. What they didn't realize was that economic stress was already compounding faster than diplomacy could relieve. A treaty can reduce one category of cost, but it cannot redesign a stagnant production system overnight. And it cannot restore a revenue stream if global prices collapse. Still, from the inside, the leaders see plausible routes out. They can negotiate, they can tighten discipline, they can accelerate reforms, they can ask citizens for patience. They can say the sacrifices are temporary because victory is near and the future is bright. The tragic irony was that the more the Soviet Union tried to look like a confident rival, the more it adopted the expensive habits of a system it did not have the cash flows to sustain. Then the price signal hits like a meteor. In retrospective accounts, oil is framed as peaking around $120 a barrel in 1980 and falling to about $24 by March 1986, an external shock that slashes the hard currency lifeline, propping up imports and stability. And that's when everything changed. But the Soviet economy is not built to adjust quickly because it lacks flexible pricing, bankruptcy mechanisms, and rapid capital reallocation. But the empire's commitments remain: military posture, allies, internal subsidies, prestige programs, and a population trained to expect guarantees. But the planners have fewer tools than outsiders assume because printing rubles does not buy what only dollars can purchase. This is where bankruptcy becomes more than a metaphor. It is the experience of a state that cannot pay for the external inputs it has quietly come to require. Gorbachev scans reports that are simultaneously technical and deeply political. He sees shortages not as isolated failures, but as signals that the whole machine is losing margin. He can attempt reform, but reform destabilizes the very controls that keep the empire coherent. He can cut spending, but cutting spending risks deterrence and status. He can try to keep spending, but keeping spending risks empty shelves and social anger. And the space program changes meaning. It is no longer only a triumph. It becomes a ledger item competing against food supply, spare parts, and political survival. The Energia Buran effort, already associated with that vast total cost, begins to look less like a pathway to the future and more like a monument that cannot be maintained. This is not because Soviet engineers forget how to build. It is because the empire's economic design cannot reconcile three pressures at the same time: dependence on hard currency earnings exposed to global commodity swings, security competition that punishes retrenchment, and domestic expectations built during years when the contradictions seemed manageable. And the consequences cascade. Short sentences land like hammers, factories stall, imports shrink, confidence falls, long sentences follow. Because collapse is never only one thing. It is the simultaneous failure of logistics, incentives, politics, morale, and credibility, all at once, in a state that has trained itself to treat bad news as sabotage rather than information. This is the peak emotional moment, the realization that the Soviet Union did not simply lose a competition. It lost the ability to finance the story that kept it together. Later, the debris becomes measurable in debt and legal inheritance. An IMF historical account notes that Russia inherited about $100 billion in external debt after the USSR broke apart, under arrangements often summarized by the zero-option approach in which Russia took on assets and liabilities. That figure is not the single cause of collapse, but it is a receipt, proof that the end of the Soviet project had an international balance sheet dimension, not only a domestic political one. The Soviet Union could put objects into orbit, but it could not put its economy on a sustainable trajectory once the export cushion vanished. In the year after the oil shock becomes undeniable, the Soviet leadership's room for maneuver shrinks dramatically, because the loss of hard currency revenue reduces the ability to import what the system had quietly come to rely on. Arms control can slow one bleed, but it cannot restore missing cash flow created by an external price collapse, and the outside world does not pause while an empire reorganizes itself. Over the longer term, 10, 20, 50 years, the world learns a hard lesson. The winner of systemic rivalry is not only the side with better engineers or better slogans, but the side with institutions that can absorb volatility without breaking legitimacy. The post-Soviet debt inheritance described in IMF history underlines that obligations do not disappear when a flag comes down. They are renegotiated, redistributed, and paid for over time. This teaches us that prestige is a currency, but it is not a convertible one. A state can buy awe with rockets for a while, yet it cannot pay import invoices with awe when commodity prices crash. It was not that the Soviet Union lacked intelligence or courage. It was that its model treated global market exposure as a temporary convenience, until that convenience became the hinge on which everything turned. Modern parallels appear wherever governments bet national stability on a narrow export base, then discover that global prices can rewrite domestic politics overnight. Modern parallels also appear in any high-cost technological rivalry where security logic pressures states to build symbolic systems, because not building them feels like defeat, even when budgets are already strained. And so the warning is not never chase space. The warning is sharper. If a nation wants to win a race to the future, it must finance that future with an economy that can survive bad luck, because bad luck is guaranteed. The Soviet Union's final lesson is not that planning fails and markets win. That is too neat. The deeper lesson is that every empire, whatever its ideology, eventually faces the same audit. Can it convert power into sustainable production and production into resilience when the world changes? Because in the end, the USSR did not run out of engineers. It ran out of room to absorb shocks. If this kind of hidden economic history is worth keeping alive, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next pattern when it repeats. Leave a comment with one answer. Was the Soviet Union undone more by oil dependence or by the deeper logistics failures that oil temporarily hid?